Welcome to another edition of
Studying with Monty!
By the 1600s, European colonies in the Americas were booming. Colonists were growing cash crops like tobacco, sugar, and rice, crops that required an enormous amount of labor. But the big question was, who would do all of this work? The answer to that question would shape history for centuries. At first, colonists tried to force Native Americans to work on plantations, but this system collapsed quickly. Native peoples had knowledge of the land, could escape more easily, and most importantly, they were dying in massive numbers from European diseases like smallpox and measles. That meant they couldn't provide the steady labor force colonists wanted. Enslaving Native Americans simply wasn't sustainable. Another labor source was indentured servants from Europe. These were poor Europeans who agreed to work for a set number of years, usually 4 to 7, in exchange for passage to the New World. While indentured servants provided some labor, the system had big problems. They were expensive to bring over, they eventually gained their freedom, and there just weren't enough of them to keep up with the massive demand for labor in the colonies. Colonists wanted a permanent, cheap, and reliable workforce, and indentured servitude could not meet that need. Sadly, this is where Africans came in. Europeans had already established trade networks along the coast of West Africa. These networks made it easier to buy and transport enslaved people. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved Africans were considered permanent labor. They and their children could be forced to work for life. Colonists believed this system would solve their labor problem. The result was the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and forced onto ships in horrifying conditions known as the Middle Passage. They were brought across the Atlantic to work on plantations in the Americas. This created the triangular trade connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of goods, labor, and profit. For Africa, the impact was devastating. Entire communities were torn apart as millions of people were taken. Wars broke out between kingdoms as groups tried to capture more people to sell to Europeans. Africa lost a part of its population, especially young men and women who could have been building families, farming, or leading their communities. Economies were disrupted, and societies were permanently changed. The slave trade weakened Africa for generations. In the Americas, enslaved Africans became the backbone of plantation economies. They grew crops like sugar, tobacco, and rice, which were exported to Europe for enormous profits. Colonies became totally dependent on enslaved labor. Without it, the plantation system would have collapsed. Slavery also shaped culture in the Americas. Enslaved Africans brought traditions, music, and foodways that influenced societies, even as they suffered under brutal conditions. For Europe, the slave trade meant wealth. Ships carried goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and valuable crops back to Europe. This triangular trade created enormous profits. That money helped Europe expand its colonies, build powerful empires, and dominate global trade. While Africans endured violence and loss, Europe grew richer and stronger. The transatlantic slave trade connected 3 continents in ways that forever shaped the world. Africa suffered population loss, warfare, and economic disruption. The Americas became dependent on enslaved labor and plantations. Europe grew wealthy and powerful, but behind all these effects was human suffering. Millions of Africans torn from their homes, families destroyed, and generations forced into slavery. The system created profit for some, but at a terrible human cost.
And as always, thank you for watching
Studying with Monty!